With Iran now admitting it shot down the plane, what will this mean for those who are grieving for their loved ones? Well, our next guest is able to give us a bit of insight into that. She's working with many of the victims and their family members in that journey. This is Yasmin Karimi. She's a registered psychotherapist and a clinical counselor who specializes in grief and loss. She's been working with the families, and you join us in studio now. So thank you for that. There's so much to go through. You told me during the break that you're working with about a dozen families who are currently mourning the loss of their loved ones in that crash. What sorts of things are they telling you?
So first of all, I'm here with such a heavy heart. And also, thank you for the opportunity to pay tribute. And also, on behalf of the community all over the world, I wanted to express gratitude to this beautiful country, and specifically to the Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Trudeau, for all the support and recognition we've received. We are so grateful for that. So basically, it's a very traumatic loss. It's not just a loss that we would typically face, because it's with tragedy, it's with a catastrophe. So it's way more complicated. It's trauma/grief. And what they basically want to make sense of, it's why it happened. And it's almost impossible to find answers for those sorts of questions. Mm-hmm. But basically, they need to start processing the emotional piece of their grief.
So today we found out, well, we got confirmation from the Iranian government saying, yes, we shot down that plane. Yes, we're responsible for the deaths. They say it was an accident, an error. But nevertheless, the question of how this happened and why it happened, those are sort of answered now for the families. Does that make it easier in any way?
I think it's made it way harder.
Why?
Because they would rather see it as a mistake, like a technical mistake, a glitch, rather than something that was due to a missile attack or something of that nature. It's added to the pain for sure. And since we got the news after 3 days of the plane crash, it's been somehow re-traumatizing to the families, of course.
The families that you're speaking with, what do they want? Do they want closure and to move on? Do they want revenge? What is it that they're seeking?
They can't even think of moving on. There's no moving on for them. You know, it's shattered their sense of reality, their sense of identity. And there's no future for them at this point, because their life has changed. There's no real moving on in that sense. You just somehow get used to it, and you'll learn to live without the deceased one, or in this case, deceased ones. So it's basically impossible to accept what's happened.
So what do you tell them? What's your guidance to this?
When we talk about grief, it's mainly the waves of emotions: resentment, anger, frustration, hopelessness, helplessness. And also, it's connecting to the society, to community, to support. So that's the main areas that you need to work on when we talk about grief, because grief is about not having control over your life or what's happened. So uncertainty, not having control, having no sense of agency is the foundation of a loss. Mm-hmm. And that piece you cannot do much about. And that takes people to the existential fear of death. You have to face it. We don't have much control. Mm-hmm. But then in this specific situation, what people think is that, yes, there has been control, but it was not well taken care of. So that's why it's added to the complication, to the natural process of grief.
Now, Yasmin, you sort of referenced this at the beginning. You said our community, and you told me that you're also a Farsi speaker, you're of Persian background. How much does that help in terms of the ability to communicate emotions that many of the people you're speaking with would be able to speak in their mother tongue? Has that made it any easier for them?
I think it's made it much easier.
Yeah.
A lot of people have some sort of a language barrier. You know, they're new to the country, they're not fully adjusted yet, so that on its own adds more layer to it. And also, there's a bit of cultural differences. Mm-hmm. You know, rituals are very different. Or the perspective we have on death, on loss. Western countries look at it as a part of life. Eastern cultures look at it as a transition into an end. It's not an end. So that kind of perspective, on top of the religious, traditional, cultural beliefs, makes it way more different than talking to a Western counselor for sure. You know, they're looking at it from a different angle than a Farsi-speaking or an Eastern counselor can do.
So eventually this story will move away from the headlines, right? But this event will last with these families for the rest of their lives. So what advice are you giving them in terms of, like you said, there's no moving on, but living on with what has happened?
That was a very good point, living on. Sometimes this grief, this trauma turns into an intergenerational trauma. So you just pass it on somehow, unintentionally, unknowingly, but it just happens. So they need to be aware of the repercussions of a trauma like that and be able to manage some of the symptoms and be able to accept the reality of the new chapter of their life and find a way to transition into a new chapter, accepting that the deceased person is gone. While I need to maintain a sense of connection, I need to establish my sense of being and identity differently.
Okay. And I know we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you one final question, which is about the greater Canadian public, right? People who may not know anyone on board that flight, who may not directly feel affected, but really the country is feeling this. And parents are talking to their kids about it. Teachers have to speak to their students. People in offices, everyone, how do you deal with the sense of helplessness that a lot of people are feeling? They want to help, but they can't. They're hurting, but they're not directly affected.
They can help, and they are helping. I've seen multiple of my clients over the past few days in tears, and they're like, Canadian. So it's human condition. We connect by association. We connect by emotions. We connect by what's familiar, and pain is familiar to all of us. They are helpful by supporting emotional support and being there, you know, providing a supportive ear, showing that kind of support they have. They're successfully showing it, and that's why we are so grateful for this beautiful country, beautiful people, and it's so honest. We're receiving so much support all around.
That is so nice to hear. Yasmin, thank you for coming in. Thank you for sharing your insights. And, you know, all of us, we wish you and the families that you're working with so much luck, and we hope at some stage there's peace for everybody.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Yasmin Karimi is a registered psychotherapist and a clinical counselor who specializes in grief and loss.